Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. My guest this week is Vice Admiral Paul Bennett, Royal Navy retired. And he could not be more appropriate as we approach Remembrance Day in the UK on the 10th of November this year, the Sunday closest to Armistice Day on the 11th of November every year, because Paul has recently taken over as the National President of the Royal British Legion and will therefore be front and centre in both the Royal Albert Hall celebrations on the Saturday night and on the Cenotaph parade on the Sunday, when he'll be laying a wreath on behalf of the Royal British Legion. And it seems appropriate, given the importance of remembrance at this time of year, to have someone who is so central to that kind of organisation. But broader than that, Paul and I have known each other for quite a long time. We were on the Higher Commander Staff course together in 2007. And he had a fantastic naval career, really interesting in all dimensions of what he actually did. Surface warfare officer, ended up in a very senior role out in NATO as the deputy commander out in Allied Command Transformation. And as a result, there's lots and lots to talk about on the leadership front, on the remembrance front, on his kind of personal journey. And I think you'll find it a fascinating conversation. I certainly did. It was great to catch up with him, and I really hope you enjoy it. Let's go. Paul, fantastic to have you on the podcast today. I'm so grateful. We've known each other quite a long time now. It's really lovely to see you again and have a chance to chat.
Bob, thank you. It is a delight, and congratulations on the series, and nice to be able to participate.
Not at all. Well, congratulations to you on your new role as the National President of the Royal British Legion, and we'll doubtless come back and talk a bit more about that in a while, not least as this one will be going out on Remembrance Sunday, and therefore couldn't be a more appropriate person to have for that episode. So I'm really chuffed that we can have you on for that. You've had a fantastic career in the Royal Navy, and culminating obviously in that new role as President of the RBL. I just think to get us started, could you just give our listeners just a bit of a kind of resume of your career so far?
Yeah, no, delighted. I was brought up in Hull, went to Newcastle University, and then joined the Navy in 1985. And I spent 36 years serving in the Navy in a variety of jobs. I would break it down into sort of three bits. One, in the first 15 years, which were mostly at sea, in lots of roles and eventually command. And then there was about a 10-year period when I was jumping from staff appointment to back to sea, and then another staff appointment. So it was a sort of mix of things, gaining experience of the Ministry of Defence and the Permanent Joint Headquarters and Navy Command whilst going back to sea. And then the last 10 years in senior positions in headquarters, so all ashore. I left 3 years ago in the summer of 21 and entered a portfolio career because I was offered the opportunity of being a senior mentor for NATO, and around that I built a few other things. So I've ended up as not deliberately, but as a senior mentor, as an advisor to business, and as you say, very recently, following the death of my very good friend Sir Clive Johnson, who was I joined up with, and who unfortunately died in May during the time as national president, I've taken over at the beginning of October and will be national president alongside the other things I do for the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, Clive Johnson was a very, very sad loss. I mean, I knew him well as well. It's an absolute tragedy, really. And sadly, we're kind of at that time of life where these things happen, and it is always a great pity, particularly when they've had such. It's got so much still to offer, really, as well as having had a great backstory behind them. And Clive would definitely be one of those. That was a real pity. For sure, I would actually quite like to talk a bit about the senior mentor bit in a while as well, because I think one of the things that's interesting about that is I do a lot of work these days in leadership consulting and training, and I think actually it's a model that a lot of organizations could do with understanding a bit about how that actually works and what you do, because it's something that often, when I work for Deloitte, for example, I think they do take back partners in some roles in terms of advisory roles still, but they tend still to be in the business. And I don't think necessarily, I use them just as an example, they tap the kind of full potential they have in terms of the overall leadership experience and kind of worldly experience they've got in the business to feed it. So, so maybe we'll look back on that one. Before we do, though, early motivations. I mean, what took you into the Navy? What was the backstory to that?
Yeah, I've struggled to answer that particular question ever since I joined. Actually, I think my Admiralty interview board, that interview board as you aspire to join the Navy, I think I was asked, why the Navy, and I gave some sort of slightly weak excuse. So I'll provide the same one to you, Bob, and see how that goes down. I don't know. I have no military background at all in the family, and I enjoyed sailing, and I was a great scout and venture scout, and I think you put those two together, and probably you get something that looks like a naval officer. I know that's. I told you it was going to be quite weak, didn't I? I was sent on a potential officer course, both to the Army and the Navy, and the Navy one. So this was 1980. Was in HMS Coventry, a Type 42 destroyer, and we sailed from Portsmouth and we thrashed up the Irish Sea up to Glasgow. We at speed, bounced around, and I was pretty ill during this transit. Helicoptered off into Glasgow Airport to get the flight home, and notwithstanding the seasickness, I was just completely taken over by the extraordinary thing about being in a warship at speed with these extraordinary people, all this technology around me, and I was fixated by it. And of course, then about 2 years later, probably 18 months later, I was in the Hull library, and on the CFAX machine it said HMS Coventry sunk in the Falklands, and I sat there for some considerable period of time thinking, how on earth could that possibly have happened to that extraordinary ship with those extraordinary people? And I remember that to this day. And a collection of all of that made me determined to join the Navy, and I did so after university.
Yeah, no, actually, that's the sort of the extra bits on that are a great story. I mean, I have to say, having been lucky enough a number of times in my career to go on either naval warships or indeed submarines as well, it is always fascinating to go and do that, and I think it is very, very compelling when you're actually out participating in a Thursday war or whatever it is, in terms of a real activity that goes on as part of the training. The Falklands was clearly a very tough time for the Navy. I mean, that's for sure, in terms of the number of ships that were lost, and some big learning points clearly came from that.
Yeah, I think when you take what you do for granted a little bit, and you don't realise how extraordinarily impressive it is. And we find that with families' days, when you go to sea with families, which they just can't quite get the extraordinary teamwork in a ship. I have to say, for me, jumping in the back of a jet, and I have a few times, Bob, was in a similar way, extraordinary experience. I, spent the whole time figuring out whether I was upside down or the right way up or whatever. And then we landed and it was all over, and I, frankly, didn't contribute at all. So we get used to what we do, don't we? Yeah,
we do. And I mean, actually, that flying in fast jet story amuses me, because I remember vividly when I was a squadron commander that obviously I was on the Jaguar. We had 2-seat airplanes. We could therefore take people flying, which was really fortunate. And it is a very sad thing these days that it's much harder to do with far less 2-seaters around in an all single-seat Air Force. But I remember vividly talking to my junior pilots, because it was quite a big deal when you become qualified to fly passengers. That's a certain, you need a number of hours to do that. You need obviously to get the tick in the box to being able to do it. And saying to a couple of these guys, look, they will be impressed taxiing out. If you're impressing yourself, you are scaring the passenger. So you don't need to do that. You just need to do your thing, and they'll love it mostly, and occasionally they'll find it a bit too much. But yeah, it is. You're right. You do definitely take it a bit for granted, and I mean the technological marvel that is out there in terms of some of the stuff we do is extraordinary. I was lucky enough to go and spend a bit of time on HMS Astute, when she was doing trials, actually, and I was in my penultimate job as Assistant Chief of Defence Staff Ops. And that blew me away, just in terms of the competence and actually the kind of temperament of the individuals that were on board the submarine. When you think what they're doing and the kind of the world they inhabit, I mean, I have to say that I was going, yeah, this is really interesting, but I'm not sure I could do this for a living. I mean, I think it takes a special kind of individual to do that.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I couldn't have been a submariner. I have a huge respect, but I need to see the sunrise and the sunset when I'm at sea. But I think that the thing I was going to say on that was that in a submarine or a ship, that the one thing that's very different from the Army and the Air Force is that you have this team of people locked together in a steel box that go away for 7 months. But you're in proximity of those people, and whether you're the chef or the engineer or the captain or one of the watchkeepers, you're playing your part in making that sort of organism work to whatever the captain and the command have decided to do. And it's a different set of relationships to the other services. There are lots of similarities, but that sort of, you're in a ship and it's all working as an organic team is, I think, very powerful.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And actually, it's a great segue into what I was going to ask you next, which is, I mean, I tend to talk about leadership journeys with people. And I mean, you've gone through the whole of the Navy, really, in terms of all the way to pretty much the top of it. And I think one of the things that always impressed me about the Navy is you have commands at a very young age. And okay, I mean, I was the flight commander on a Jaguar squadron, but I've got a boss who's in immediate proximity to me as the squadron commander. You probably, as a lieutenant commander, go out and command a ship, and then again as a commander, et cetera, and up the chain. And of course, not only are you in that role, but also you're some instances and at far-flung distances from the UK, having to make some really challenging, fast-paced decisions that have far-reaching consequences. I'm just really interested in your own adaptation of your leadership style as you've gone up through all those various command opportunities and actually not just necessarily in command, and how conscious, unconscious that has been in terms of a journey for you.
I realised that we were going to chat leadership by definition in this podcast, Bob. So I just gave a little bit of thought to it. I think there is I'll come back to them, but there's a sort of commonality of sort of leadership skills that will be different to individuals, and I'll tell you what I think mine are shortly. And I think I'm not sure you adapt your leadership style. I think that there are some fundamentals that are absolutely common, and perhaps that adaptation is sort of on the edges depending on the context, but not necessarily the way you lead. I think my journey would be from the start in a sort of functional ship-based environment, that steel box that I talked about, small groups that you were in command of or you had authority over, and with a big lot of hierarchy above. So you were sort of protected from the big decisions, but you were making small decisions and leading and motivating a small group of people. And the second bit was then command. And that becomes much more, it's still functional. It's still tactical command. It in more decisions, and you've become responsible. And I think that does change how that works. Then there's a leadership and a staff appointment. So in the Ministry of Defence or in the Permanent Joint Headquarters, where you're given more freedom to work at the lower level, but there's a huge hierarchy above you. So you're not really given much responsibility. You're pushing paper, but nevertheless, you're trying to lead a small group of people. And then the bit I found the most difficult would be my next, is that you get more senior in staff appointments, that you then get involved with politics. And I found that the most difficult personally for me. You have to far more determine how you're going to lead your organization. And it's about the other person. It's not about your organization. It's about the other person, the person that you're serving, which is the politician, and getting your leadership context in the sense of that person, I think is a tricky thing. My next bit was a multinational headquarters, and I think perhaps we'll come back to it. But the stimulation of leading a a group for NATO. So about 37 nations were involved in my headquarters, and you were dealing with all the international characteristics of which there are an array of things in that regard. And I found that very stimulating because, if you tell a German or an American or a Brit to do something, he or she will go away and do it and will be delighted to have that direction. If you tell a Spaniard or a Frenchman or an Italian to do that, they'll say, "Why are you telling me how to do that?" Because you just tell me what needs to be done and I'll figure out how to do it. And, so that's a trite example, but something that's hugely important if you're going to get the most out of people. That leadership in a multinational environment I found really stimulating. And then the final bit, and we talked briefly about it, was that leadership in a mentor and advisory function. I mean, you are leading to a degree, but you're leading from behind, without a doubt. You're providing advice, and it's not about you. It's absolutely about the individual, the organization that you're dealing with. But you're leading in a way because you're mentoring them based on your experience. So I think that's my journey. If perhaps I just touch on the things that I think I would identify from Paul Bennett's framework in that regard, I would put the first thing that I think is crucial in leadership is humility, and that is because you identify that you don't know everything, so you listen, and you're interested in people, and if you're interested in people, people will bond themselves to you. You are able to lead because they know you are trying to do the best for them, and that's humility. That's not just giving direction. Communications is a pretty obvious one. I think lead by example. I would like to think that I went through my career being cheerful, engaging, and I found that's the only way to do that for my own well-being. But also, I think it helped. And then giving space to other people, the trust, so you're not on top of each other all the time. Mission command and enabling people to do their best and giving them space to not fail, but to have a couple of little problems is a good thing because everyone learns. And the last point, which I think probably it overreaches all of that, is someone said to me right at the beginning of my career, what's your legacy of your leadership? And the legacy is not what Paul Bennett did, because that's easily forgotten. What it is what have I done to give them the greatest opportunity, reported on them effectively, and they've been successful. And if I've done that, then I think that's the key to leadership, is the success of the people that you've led downstream.
No, I totally agree with that. I think there's some great examples in there of a lot of the points I would pick up on as well. I mean, I think particularly leading by example, I think so vital, and humility, and actually the difference you make, in shaping the people that come behind you. And if they continue to stay in touch with you, and just recently, actually, somebody contacted me on LinkedIn or commented on a post I put on LinkedIn in the first instance. And and you could tell it was a guy who'd worked for me years ago, 25 years ago, who's going, they're lucky to have you doing this kind of stuff. And you go, wow, I mean, that's very warming to have that kind of thing, that people recognize that, you have made a bit of a difference to them as well. And that's really, really a great place to be. I totally get the multinational thing too. I mean, it's very interesting with the work I do nowadays at Deloitte University, where a group I've just been with, actually, we had 26 different nations. And so exactly that, they're all very different. They're different language competency, obviously. We're working in English, but not all of them by any means are native English speakers. And that generates some challenge, but also culture. I mean, culture is such a big thing if you're in that kind of environment with what do we actually mean by, there's one of these little definitional things out there, isn't there, about when a Brit says this, they actually mean this. And, when an American says this, they actually mean this, and there are so many of those little nuances that I think is so funny.
It's a great challenge. I think we do tend to treat individuals as ourselves speaking a foreign language, as opposed to treating them as a person comes with a different culture. But there is absolutely no doubt that in a NATO context, the answer may come slightly slower because you have more stakeholders in the room. But the richness of the discussion, because people come from different perspectives, is so much better than in a national context. And I think for business men and women dealing in a multinational environment, for military people dealing in a multinational environment, understanding that people are different and understanding what that difference might be, in order that you don't get frustrated by the individual. You actually think about, why am I frustrated by that? Well, actually, it may be that that you just are approaching that relationship in a way that doesn't work, and you could be much more intelligent about those relationships if you understand that. So I think it's something I'm hugely stimulated by.
Yeah, that's a great point. Really, really good point. I mean, looping back to sort of an earlier chapter, in fact, pretty much the first time we met back in 2007, I remember well, we were on the High Commander Staff course together. You were just about to go and be the captain of HMS Daring as the first in class of the Type 45 destroyers. And I mean, I had a kind of similar-ish experience in that I was a station commander at Coningsby with Typhoon when it was brand new. But you were taking this quite expensive asset as the first captain of the first one. What was that like, and how did that differ from any other command roles you had in the Navy?
You'd expect me to say it was an incredible privilege. I mean, command is a privilege when whatever it is, whether that's a small patrol boat or a big destroyer or an aircraft carrier, it's a great privilege. But bringing a new capability into UK defence is something that very few people get the privilege of doing. And there's clearly a great responsibility and a challenge in that. I think we regrettably, as human beings, tend to look at the new ship and think, well, it's just a modern version of the old ship, where the capabilities that these new platforms offer is just off the scale compared to the older platforms. And we have to be able to help, or I think the commander, the commanding officer, has to play a role in helping UK defence, in my case, the Royal Navy, understand how we need to change operations in the future, because we've got a very different capability. So that, I think, in strategic terms, was a great challenge. And then the other great opportunity is that you are setting the culture of that class. I'm saying that with real meaning, because if you set the culture of a ship and you set the culture of how are they going to operate? How are they going to operate internally? What's the sort of going to be the feeling in the ship? That is something the commanding officer can do in a warship. And when you set it for a class, and now I can now watch Type 45s around the world thinking, actually, there's a little bit of Paul Bennett in that because we set it up. I mean, clearly there'll be other commanding officers who've played their part in adapting and modifying and improving that. But we started the process, and I take an enormous amount of pride out of doing that.
Yeah, I totally recognize that, and on a kind of different type of thing. But with the Typhoon, it was exactly the same. You've got brand new capability that the defence has spent a lot of time and a lot of money on building. But one of the things that grieves me, I'm sure you may well feel the same about this, is the amount of effort that you have to put in at the time, but also actually for a long time subsequently. With Typhoon was a good example where you still had people who were beating up the aeroplane for it was Cold War legacy, it was irrelevant, it wasn't ever going to be what it needed to be. And anybody that ever got in the aeroplane, I think we did very successfully change their attitude. I remember vividly flying a guy called Jeff Mead, who's is actually still quite friendly with him now, who was a Sky News correspondent, who, by his own admission, had been a big skeptic. And we used to joke about, we had the thing called the Typhoon grin, because everybody that flew the airplane, it was like a Formula One car. You got out of it and you couldn't fail but smile. And guess what? We got back, and he was absolutely in that mode. He was met by his crew at the who were filming us taxiing back in, and he got out of the airplane, luckily still kind of hale and hearty and having not had too hard a time in the airplane. And he loved it. And I think it, just in the little snapshot of what you can show a journalist in that kind of capability, it had completely changed his attitude. And I feel for you in the sense that Type 45 is obviously, and obviously other ships in the Navy recently as well, have coming for a bit of a pasting in the media, which is really, really hard to swallow when you know what effort has gone in and actually what the kind of underlying capability is, isn't it?
Yeah, we can't hide away from in Type 45 terms the re-engineering that was necessary, and I find that enormously frustrating, as I know my colleagues still in the Navy do. And how we got to that point, I don't think that's not for now. It's not speculation, but and we can't do anything other than say that's just wrong. But the Type 45s are at sea, repeatedly now, and doing great things. And you can be depressed about that availability thing, which the Navy is working extremely hard to get sorted out and will crack it. But on the other hand, you then say, well, HMS Diamond, down at the bottom of the Red Sea earlier this year, being able to command the environment in an extraordinary, difficult environment where ballistic missiles and other projectiles were being fired at merchant ships, and was able to sort the picture out, take her part in shooting complex missiles down, and being able to command other ships in support. And that's exactly why we bought the Type 45, and it's doing exactly what Type 45 and UK defence demands of it. And so if you're a cup half full, you'll talk about Diamond. If you're a cup half empty, you'll talk about poor HMS Daring that has been refit and maintenance for far too long. And I can't wait until we get all 6 operating, and that will happen, I'm sure, very soon.
That's very fair, and I think you could say the same thing about Typhoon. There are plenty of issues that either capability elements that have not really come to fruition at all well, or were very, very late. But the bottom line, exactly the same thing. If you look at the complexity of what they're now doing with that aeroplane, by contrast to when I was flying it, to look at the things they're doing over Syria and Iraq and incredibly complex missions, which one young individual sat in the cockpit is having to make some really quite challenging and very, very fast-paced decisions, and the airplane is helping him do a lot of that, which is a really good thing. And it's come a hell of a long way in terms of what the selection of weapons and opportunities and capability that the thing has. But no, it's great when defense moves in that kind of direction. I just wish A, it wouldn't take so long some of the time, and B, that we wouldn't get the kind of panning along the way that we always seem to get, because it is frustrating. I guess that takes us also to you go through a full career, as you and I both did, and you come to the end of it and you transition out. How have you found that journey out of the Navy? How's it been for you since you left?
I've been a little surprised how unsettling it was, and perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, but I'm not sure I was ever really told. I probably didn't talk to enough people about it, because you spent 36 years in an institution, and it's not about the rank. It's not about the job. It's about you're part of an institution you fundamentally believe in. And I think when you come to the other side of it, something is missing. So my journey was about a year in which I felt quite unsettled, not in a what am I going to do thing. I was entirely happy to get on with this portfolio. I was lucky to become a NATO senior mentor. I built up a few other roles, but I couldn't look myself in the mirror and say that this felt normal. It just felt abnormal. And I think after a year, I was able to do that. I think I've been very fortunate to have built a small portfolio that has got lots of variety, some paid, some pro bono, but is varied, enjoyable, lots of different facets in it. And so I now, having got over that first year, feel very comfortable doing it. Sometimes I feel I'm working full time and I shouldn't be, and I got it wrong. Sometimes I'm feeling I should be working a bit harder, but I think that's the portfolio life which you and I both share. But so I don't think we should underplay what feels like is a transition. I did read a book that was about businessmen and women leaving their job and feeling exactly the same. So this is not a military thing. This is about individuals who have played a part in an institution and suddenly are on the other side feeling a little bit lost and finding their way through the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I remember when I left after I did 34 and a half years in the end in the Air Force, and when I left, a couple of things really struck me. One was when I actually got my last pay statement, and I suddenly realized I am actually now unemployed. And I haven't been unemployed since I was 18. And that was definitely a bit of a moment. And I was on the cusp of going and working for Deloitte and, changing career completely. But I hadn't quite at that point signed the contract. So I was definitely not in that category. And I think then the sort of reflections I had subsequently when I joined Deloitte, the steepness of the learning curve, because I think like a lot of, all of us in the military, really, you move jobs every 2.5, 3 years, and you pride yourself on having a lot of agility and being able to land in very different roles in very different places, doing very different things. And you've alluded to a lot of that with your own career. The thing that, of course, I'd completely taken for granted and never really thought about was that all of the substructure, the kind of admin process and that underpins what you do, that was the same, even though you were moving jobs. And suddenly I'd moved to a corporation or a partnership where it was nothing like that. Everything was different. The entire admin process, the way you got paid, the way you got assessed, the way you looked for and did work was all entirely different. So it's just all those little nuts and bolts things that, as you say, was quite unsettling. So I completely recognize what you're saying. I had exactly the same kind of significant transition process challenge, I suppose.
Yeah, and then I think the thing really brought it home was soon after. It wasn't soon after I left. Was that the Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was the days where you and I have shared experiences in various conflict areas around the world, and you chat to people, you find out what's going on. You're clearly security cleared. You're able to have these conversations. Get great pride in what your service is doing in support of that. And all of a sudden, I was getting all my intelligence from the Times newspaper and feeling that I was completely detached from what was an extraordinary period of military activity and endeavour in support by UK armed forces, and I was disconnected, really unable to know what was really going on, and I found that a little frustrating, but and I really did bring it home that I was no longer part of the team.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, and I've had a couple of funny experiences like that where I'd only been at Deloitte a few weeks actually, and one of our former army colleague friends had kind of slightly chucked me under the bus and given my name to Sky News to talk to them about Syria when the whole Syria thing was kicking off. So I got cold called by a Sky News correspondent who wanted to talk about Syria. And we had a brief chat, and he then said, well, look, I'd really like you to do something kind of on the record and in the studio and things. And I said, well, yes, but, A, my current employer has to be very happy with that, and B, the Air Force has to be happy with that, because I'm not going to be some armchair air marshal pontificating about what's going on without actually any input. And the Air Force was actually pretty happy about it, and that was fine. The interesting thing was Deloitte just said a flat no. Said, no, you work for us now. This is, we're not going to turn around and let you play in that space at all. Thank you very much. This is, we're a global company. You need to focus on doing this. And so that was the end of that. But the other one was much more recently, where actually when the Paris Olympics happened, and if you remember on the day of the opening ceremony, they had those arson attacks on the rail network. And as a result, I actually ended up being called by another friend of mine, ex-Air Force officer, who said, Newsnight are looking for somebody to go and speak about security at the Olympics. He and I had done a lot of that, and he wasn't available. They initially asked him, and so he put my name in it. So I ended up sat on the sofa in Newsnight. And here we are. I did. London 2012 was 12 years ago, and so I'm now busy talking about what happened 12 years ago. And it was. Initially, I thought quite hard about it on the way up into London to think, right, what am I going to say? And then I was watching the opening ceremony, and I was while I was sat in the green room, and Newsnight was kind of just on the back in terms of time of the opening ceremony. I said, I'm kind of hoping this finishes before I go on the sofa, just in case something happens that they might want to talk about that I don't know has happened, even, which would be terrible. But yeah, you get that kind of weird disconnect, don't you, where you're suddenly in a position where you are properly out of the loop, as it were, and it is definitely it's a funny feeling when that happens. I completely understand that.
Yeah.
When you look backwards, all the way over 36 years in the Royal Navy and what you've done subsequently, if you were looking to talk to your young self, going, I don't really know why I'm joining the Royal Navy, what would you be advising him now?
So I would definitely be advising him to do what I did. I look back, and a career in the military is pretty tough in domestically. You have to have a pretty special family to be able to cope with it. So I'm not suggesting that this is it's all joyous and easy by any means. But in terms of how Paul Bennett would have played the most impact on society, I think I proved that is being done through the Royal Navy and UK Armed Forces, and I would be advising young Paul Bennett to go for it. I would advise the young Paul Bennett to take up tennis and to play the piano, both of which I don't do. And I think that I've missed so many great opportunities in music world and socially, and I could have. I think doing that would have been would have been much better. Probably should have done that, but otherwise, no, go for it.
Yeah, the music thing amuses me because when I was at school, it was quite a musical school that I was at, and I started out learning to play the trumpet. That would be massively overstating what I actually achieved in doing that with the trumpet. But my mother at that stage, my father having died when I was very young, my mother was a dog breeder and was running a boarding kennel, so she had at any given stage upwards of 50 dogs in the kennels. So her enthusiasm level for me learning to play the trumpet to say it was less than zero would be no exaggeration. So I did not get a great deal of parental support or inspiration for that particular endeavor, which is probably not surprising that it died.
Well, we share that because I played the trumpet until I was 18, and I was a perfectly average second trumpet at school. But once you leave school and you get into the big wide world, you realise that you're not at average second trumpet level. You're significantly below that. So I quickly packed it up, which is a great shame. But there we are.
Yeah, I get it's interesting, isn't it? Because it is again one of those things I think we tend to take for granted, that learn music at an early age and and it's just one of those things, and then you just do it. When we had a set of, where I live in Sussex, a former set of neighbours of ours were both in the orchestra in the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, and he was a trombonist and his wife was a flautist. And we used to hear them very regularly. They had a little studio literally just across the road from us, and they were practicing all the time, just to turn around and hone the skills and make sure they're ready for the right pieces and everything else. And I think it's one of those things where all these deep specializations, just as the ones we've had, they are not things that you just turn around and learn it and that's it. You do it forever. You have to keep on top of it, keep refining it, keep developing it. It's a never ending journey.
Yeah, 10,000 hours point. But also, you have an enormous amount of professional pride in what you do, whatever that is, whether you're playing music in the Royal Opera House or you're flying a jet or driving a ship. And I think we instinctively made every effort to make sure that went as well as we could. But we can't do everything.
Yeah, this is true.
Some things, if you don't quite have the aptitude, and that was right by the sound of it for you and me about trumpet playing, there was little point in trying to do 10,000 hours because it was never going to happen.
You went considerably further on that journey than I did. I was nowhere near even being a trumpet of any sort, never mind a second trumpet. I tend to talk about highs and lows, Paul, on this because everybody has them over a lengthy career. And I know lots of people, including me, actually tend to say, well, I don't really like looking back. I tend to look forward, and I'm eternally kind of put that in the rearview mirror and learn from what went on and move on. But is there anything that you would have done differently if you're looking back across your career?
Yeah, I'm sure there are lots of things that little incidents that you could have done better. I think in latterly, the point I was making around really thinking about the other individual, I probably went through my career being a little frustrated by some interactions that I had and assuming it was the other person's fault rather than mine. Why doesn't he or she understand what I'm saying? Sort of thing. And I'm right. I don't understand why that individual doesn't see it. And I think if I had taken and a number of those, I don't fall out with people very easily, but on those times where you're finding the relationship difficult, to have had the discipline to step back and think about why that relationship is not working and recognize that the problem might be me, I think that would have been. I think I'd have been more effective in a handful of relationships, and it came home to me in this Allied Command Transformation, this NATO role I had, where I was working for a very senior French Air Force general, and finding a relationship tricky. I now, having thought about it much more, understand how I could have been more effective, and I feel as though I could have had another go at that, and General Anata and I think would have found it much easier to sort of work alongside each other, and there were just things that I could have done better by thinking about a little bit more about exactly where he and others were coming from in that regard. So that's what I would say. I don't. That's not really a low, but it's a self-critical point saying, where might you have been more effective? And I think that consideration of the other person when you're finding a relationship a little bit more difficult than it should be is, I think, the lesson I would give myself.
Yeah, I think it's a really useful lesson for other people as well. I mean, that step back from the situation and look yourself in the mirror a little bit and say, am I actually part of the problem as opposed to being kind of the one that's got the solution here? Because I think that's definitely true. I mean, there's always two sides or multitude of sides depending on the kind of nature of the conversation. And yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. What about high points then? What's the career high point for Paul Bennett?
Well, I think command, without a doubt, is the key. Being command of a ship, whether that's a ship. My first ship was HMS Biter, which was a small patrol boat which took university students from Manchester University to sea, and had a ship's company of 4. But it was still command. I learned a huge amount. But if you're given the responsibility of a ship, whether that's HMS Biter or HMS Daring, and you're told that you have a responsibility for that. And that first day at sea on HMS Biter, when I was looking around for somebody to be looking over my shoulder and telling me that I was doing something wrong, and all of a sudden they weren't there, and I realised that this was all on me. I mean, my goodness, what a moment that was in this tiny little ship. And then taking...
What rank were you doing that?
A lieutenant. I was 26.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big deal. I mean, because you've got you literally other people's lives in your hands and and lots of responsibility, because that's amazing.
And then probably if you take command to then, what was the best command? At the age of 34, and I still wonder, my children are now at that age, and at 34 I was commanding HMS Exeter, a Type 42 destroyer, and we took Exeter, worked her up, took her out to the Gulf, operated in the Gulf for 5 or 6 months, and brought her back. And bringing her alongside with every member of the ship's company, in good form, alive, because sometimes you have a nasty incident of someone gets knocked over by a taxi, and and on your watch. We weren't in conflict, but we were operating in a pretty significant operational theatre, and we came back, everyone intact, ship in good shape, with a good reputation. And I put her alongside, and I thought, my goodness, that is just the most extraordinary thing. Breathe a huge sigh of relief, an element of that responsibility eased from the shoulders, because that was it. I was leaving the ship in a few weeks' time and handing over to somebody else. But that was a very powerful feeling of achievement, and just pride.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, that's a great story, and I think you're right. I mean, it's great when you come out of those sort of things with nothing has gone horribly wrong. I mean, the losing people thing is one of the tough ones for sure, isn't it? I mean, I had that as a squadron commander. It was great because I was exactly in that position. I came out of it. We hadn't lost anybody in any kind of event, which was lovely. Couldn't be said for all my fellow squadron commanders at the time, where we'd had the odd accident and things. And so, no, it was terrific. And I think probably all of us, you want to leave it better than you found it, don't you? If you're taking over the organization, it's always great to take over from someone that's not done a brilliant job, because you've got an easier bar to jump over. But just occasionally it doesn't work that way either, and you've got a really really high bar that you've got to climb over. And as long as you do, and it's continuous improvement, then I think that's that's a very, very satisfying element of what we used to do.
And then on a personal level, it would be wrong for me to say that actually one of the greatest achievements is that I'm still married to the same lady, Kay, and with two children who are fabulous and now producing grandsons. And to do that with a husband and father that has been away for a long period of time, as anyone in the forces is an enormous achievement, which I place mostly the credit for on Kay, clearly, rather than me. But nevertheless, I take some pride out of the fact that is the case.
Yeah, that's worth a little diversion actually on the family thing, because again, I talk quite regularly on some of the stuff I do now about in the commercial world, where I think on youngsters and not so youngsters really, there's relentless pressure. There's lots and lots of deadlines, sales pressure, and work ethic that is pretty aggressive, to say the least. And I tend to make the point to them a lot of the time that, look, it's like a set of scales. You've got work on the one hand and personal life on the other hand, and you've got to keep them at least reasonably in balance. And one of them can pull you back. If the other one's slightly out, then you can hopefully fix it by having a good home life when your work life's suffering a bit, or vice versa. What you can't afford to do is let both of them go at the same time, because then you're in real trouble in terms of trying to rescue it. Just your reflections, because the Navy has always been, I spent plenty of time away from home, but it tended to be in big chunks on operational deployments or in short chunks on exercises. I mean, you will have spent many, many occasions when you've been away from home for months, often when your kids were very young and all that sort of thing. What was your sort of coping strategy for that as a family?
To a degree, we just got on with it. And now watching our young daughters managing small children, you think, my goodness. And they would and Kay was doing that while I was at sea by herself. I mean, there was a good community around her of other ladies who were going through exactly the same. But that doesn't take anything away from just how hard that was, without a doubt. Interesting, Kay has kept a record of the number of nights we spent together since 1985, and she just started. And the first 2 or 3 years of my naval career, we were together for about 80 days a year.
Yeah.
So just shockingly small. And then obviously later on in shore jobs, in Portsmouth, I was home for 340 days. Anyway, the grand total at the end of 36 years is that I was at home overnight for 60.4% of my career, which means I was away for 14 years. And that's not done for any sort of sense. Oh my goodness, that is a statistic that just captures the reality of being part of the armed forces. And I also don't think that's a necessarily bad thing. But yeah, it has to work. It's no surprise that a lot of people leave when the kids are small and they just need to spend more time with the kids. And I completely respect that. And it's not for everyone. For us, it worked, partly because, as I said, Kay, it was okay for her. She had the stability. She enjoyed a happy husband when he came home and got a lot out of being part of this sort of naval community. But, the impact is pretty obvious. It doesn't really need me to spell it out. The impact is significant. There were times where you get it wrong. So saying yes to an invitation to a dinner on Kay's 30th birthday, when I should have been at home on a 30th birthday, I'll never be forgiven for that. So the number of times I've been told that on her 30th birthday she had scrambled egg on toast at home by herself, I've lived the implication of that very bad decision for the last 20 odd years, quite rightly so.
They don't forget, do they? That's the trouble. They really don't forget.
Small issue, but I got it completely wrong.
Yeah, that time away thing is interesting. I was lucky enough to go and do a returning deterrent submarine visit, and as you know from that process, when there's one coming back off patrol, they tend to put some sort of senior officer on board to welcome them back. And one of the things I did as part of that was present medals, dolphins, and deterrent pins to to the crew. And they have this thing where they have a steel pin for your first patrol on a deterrent submarine, and they have a gold one which they give out for 25 patrols. And that day, I presented 3 gold deterrent pins. And bearing in mind, your average patrol is 3 months. And it's patrols, not months. It's allocated on patrols. I think that's basically 6 years underwater with no communication, or next to no communication at all. I mean, no communication out, very limited communication in, doing that continuous sea deterrent thing, which, I just found that quite extraordinary. I mean, that is a level of commitment that is unimaginably impressive, really. Tremendous that we've got people who are prepared to do that.
It is, but they will get enormous amounts of professional pride. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. And I think recognizing the key in leadership is to recognize that is extraordinary commitment, and how we then don't take it for granted, but recognize it as in whatever way. So the pin is one way, in making sure that we support the families and we give them uninterrupted leave when they come back. We try and not churn them, notwithstanding the people problems that are faced. And this is all really important, but never take it for granted. It is extraordinary. There are lots of extraordinary things around, but that's just one.
Yes, it is for sure. Sadly, for every kind of set of high points and positive things, there are usually some low ones. What is your career low point?
I think the low point was the thing that I found most difficult was I was as a rear admiral run for a role in the Ministry of Defence, and I was selected for it through the machine of the Ministry of Defence, and then there was a little bit of politics that was played into this mix, and the decision was changed, and I spent 6 months, I think, not sure whether I was firstly going to get a job at all, and may had to leave the Navy, whilst we were going through the really tough old HR process that clearly civil servants do all the time, but it's slightly unusual and alien to us military people. And that was hugely unsettling for the first time that I'd ever done that. I just didn't know. It knocked my confidence, because I was suddenly, having been selected, was kind of deselected for more political reasons. I understood the political reasons. As I said earlier in the podcast, we are servants of our political masters. But when you're on the receiving end, you really don't know what this looks like. And it may be that the decision is taken and you have to leave the Navy because of it, because you just run out of jobs. You know how that works. I found that enormously difficult in a service that otherwise I had given enormous amount to, and I was going job to job, mostly, in fact, probably always, relatively successfully. And then suddenly, perhaps the reality of what lots of people go through, especially in the civilian world, and finding those jobs and coming second and all that sort of business. That was the first time, and I reflect that was pretty hard on me, but really hard on the family, for whom they wore quite a lot of the impact of that.
Yeah, I feel for you, and I think that is very tough, and it is unfortunate. A lot of the time, I think it is at the more senior levels where some of these things start to play into the mix as well. And so, how did you bounce back from it, though? What was your kind of, because you obviously did go on and you got a 3-star job and moved on to do that very successfully. How did the kind of recovery process work from that?
Yeah, eventually, and this is not in a way that it should have happened earlier, but the First Sea Lord recognised that this thing was going on and brought me in and said, "Hey, Paul, you're a victim of this political system. Okay, let's live with that, and I will ensure that you get another job." And he recognised that this was not of my making. It was anyone's real making, but that. If I got the job, then great. If I didn't, and I didn't, then he would find a job, and it happened that another officer had left and was leaving anyway, so it worked very easily for him. But the fact that he had identified that I was under a little bit of personal pressure, and that he said, "Okay, I will undertake that I'll look after was the way that worked. As you can tell from the conversation, it still weighs a little heavily on me, but I'm well past it, and I ended up doing an extremely good job as head of capability in the Navy, and then went on via one other role to be promoted to 3-star and do the NATO role at the end of the career. So, the Paul Bennett story has a very happy ending, but I those times where you haven't experienced that, almost that lack of confidence in the system in you, having had a lot of confidence in Paul Bennett up till then, weighed pretty heavily.
Yeah, no. I can imagine. Really, really helpful. Thanks very much. That's that's extremely interesting and useful, and I think will resonate also with a lot of other people who are in similar kind of positions. But on a more positive note, I mean, we all live incredibly busy lives. We often struggle to find the time to relax and get away from particularly in a world of social media and constant email and all those sorts of things. What do you do to kind of give yourself a bit of R&R, if you like, and recover and just do some work-life balance?
Well, I don't claim brilliance in this regard, the work-life balance. I think the sort of workaholic tendency is most definitely there. Not, and that's entirely my own fault. I spend a lot of time. I enjoy being outside, so I sail and row and cycle and have groups of good mates who I do that with, and the portfolio thing allows an element of being able to place these in the diary through the week to be able to crack that. I think when I was working in the Navy and in the joint world with you, Bob, I'm not sure my work-life balance was as good as it should have been, and I think that was partly. I was going to say it was partly expected. Perhaps it was because everyone was working too hard. But I think I'm learning about work-life balance, and when you get these shocks of mates who pass on at far too young an age, you do think whether we should just give ourselves a little bit of space, because we need to make sure we enjoy this life as well as contributing as much as you can to it.
No, I totally agree with you. I think, and that does really bring it home to you, doesn't it? When you have people either falling seriously ill or as I say, passing away with stuff. But and I think we're all as guilty as the next person. I'm just amused reflecting on you going sailing for a hobby. I presume there is a degree of pressure going sailing with your mates when Vice Admiral Royal Navy. It can't really go wrong, can it? I mean, if you
yeah, I think the running aground thing, or if you did that, a little bit of sort of seamanship incompetence, which of course it's in everyone. The possibility of that would be poor, because I just feel that even my best mates would feel the need to tell everyone.
Yeah, I suspect that's true. Yeah, that's like me going and doing some private aviation and ending up in the wrong space. That would be a bad thing. So, yeah, definitely so. Hey, I always try and cover. There's a couple of sort of biggish topics. I've got a couple of questions at the very end that I always ask everybody. But there's two things I'd really like to talk to you about. One is the NATO thing. I mean, you finished up as one of the very senior NATO commanders. And notwithstanding it's a little while ago, you look at what's going on in the world now with the kind of political tensions in a place that, frankly, I don't recall ever seeing it like this. I mean, I was in the Cold War at the front end of my career out in Germany when Cold War was coming to an end, and it was all pretty tense then. But this is a kind of whole new level of ugliness, really. And obviously, on one level, the alliance has got bigger, and two powerful additions in the guise of Sweden and Finland. And that's a good thing, but at the same time, there's clearly real pressure on budgets and on actual sort of fractures in terms of who's agreeing to do what, and what level of commitment should we be supplying to countries that are in peril along the way and things like that. I'd just be interested in your reflections on where you think that goes and how that ends up, and I mean, not least given the obvious uncertainty across the Atlantic in terms of presidential elections and where that might or might not go.
Yeah, it's a big question. I'm a huge advocate for NATO. I came to it too late in my career. We obviously knocked around at sea in NATO forces, and so we weren't disconnected from NATO. But it was the first time as a 3-star vice admiral that I had worked within the NATO machine, and I think it is extraordinary. 32 nations now able to work together to deliver a single NATO perspective. And that is that. I mean, I'll just unpack that because that's not, it's almost true, not quite. I mean, you've got 32 sovereign nations who are all delivering, but it's within the context of an overall alliance. And there are two really important elements, which I think are often missed. It always seems, people like poking at nations, the press like when nations disagree with each other and say, oh, that's the NATO alliance, shattering. In fact, that's the whole point of the NATO alliance, is that you've got 32 nations who come together politically and can share perspectives. And there's no way that every nation is going to think the same. I mean, back to our previous conversation. But the important thing is there are 32 nations who are debating hugely difficult subjects around the North Atlantic Council, and that in itself is good enough, really, for NATO, because that is something that is just enormously precious. I mean, people say, "Oh, well, what about Turkey? What about Hungary? What about this, that, and the other?" If these countries aren't in the room, you can't have a conversation with them, and that is just so important. So the alliance is much stronger for having lots of different perspectives, even though some of the conversations are uncomfortable. And then, of course, underneath that, there's this huge military machine, and as you know well, the pressure of making sure that we are interoperable, and interoperable is not just about communications; it's about procedures, it's about how we think, it's about how we structure our armed forces, all of that, which enables us on the battlefield, whether in the air or at sea or on the land, to be able to operate together. And that doesn't come easily. That is something we have to fight every day to do better. And that, of course, is militarily why the alliance is so important. And then, you have the reality of today is that you've got probably the most ready NATO that has been since the Cold War. I can unpack that a little bit if you wish.
Yeah, on the interoperability point, I mean, I go back to the Cold War, where we had the TACEVAL process, tactical evaluation process, that really tested us in terms of readiness and capability and interoperability. And I can remember in the Air Force, we used to go and fly to other bases, and there was a tested process where other nations would have to be able to turn around and rearm, refuel, service our aircraft to enable us to go and do other missions. And a lot of that since the Cold War has fallen away, certainly on the Air Force side. And I just wonder, with a little bit of a kind of spectacles from the past view, whether or not we have lost stuff that we need to now start really regaining. What do you think?
I think interoperability is we approach it as kind of an absolute. We've got to be able to communicate with everyone all the time, anywhere. And that, of course, is not what interoperability is about. The interoperability is about, if you've got an operational plan that requires forces from different nations, or indeed forces from our own nation, to operate together, you need to be able to deliver sufficient interoperability that enables that to happen. So, your point, and I'm no expert in the air domain, as you quite rightly know, is that if we're expecting UK jets to be able to operate in really intimately with other nations' jets, that interoperability needs to be extremely good, and we need to practice it. If it is about taking different missions disconnected from each other by geography, then, in actual fact, as long as you are able to deconflict, you don't need to have fabulous interoperability, and that is a commander's decision, that she decides on how that operation is going to work, and you need to make sure you've got sufficient interoperability to support that plan.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the and probably that latter direction is where we're more headed, I think, than being too intimate in the way you described it as well, because I think it's really challenging to do that. But obviously there are some things, just in terms of weapon types and down to calibers of ammunition and things like that. There were, in the old days, there was real emphasis on we need to be having the same stuff so we don't end up in a ridiculous situation that actually my rifle's broken and I can't use your ammo.
Yeah, and there's too much of that sort of thing that still needs to be solved. Despite the efforts, and that's why I said this interoperability thing is not it's not easy. Notwithstanding the efforts, there are still too many areas that we could do better on, and lots of efforts going into it. I mean, I would just on the finishing off of the NATO thing, Bob. I think there are two things that I would highlight strategically. You mentioned one, which is the US position, and specifically the interesting, worrying words that Donald Trump has said a few times about NATO. I'm never quite sure what is really meant by that, because the US could not be more committed to NATO and integrated and gaining such a lot by having bases around the NATO territory. So I think we need to temper our worries a bit, but nevertheless, it's not helpful at all. And without a committed America, NATO becomes a much less sort of coherent and powerful body. I don't want to overplay that, but it is absolutely something we have to watch and be careful about. And the other is that of course there is a focus on the Asia Pacific region. Taiwan being the headline, but other things like North Korea, and that's outside the NATO AOR. And I'm not suggesting that NATO should be involved in the Asia Pacific area, but nations will be all nations will be considering what their role might be in support of the US or in support of their own sovereign, requirements and their own territories. And that is already playing out as an element of tension, because once you're sort of trying to prioritize something like that, then something's going to give. At the moment, as I said, NATO couldn't be more ready and stronger based around the experiences in Ukraine. And I think we should have enormous pride and be very impressed by what General Cavoli and others have achieved over the last few years. But that is not in any way saying that I'm complacent about it for the future.
Yeah, and amusingly, I mean, our mutually good friend, General Sir Richard Barrons, said on I think I was on a while ago, that if Vladimir Putin was up for NATO Employee of the Month, he'd probably be winning it all the time, because I think he's done more to unify, strengthen, and bring together the alliance than many other things have done over many decades, to be honest. And I'm sure, absolutely sure, that one of his worst fears must have been actually NATO getting bigger, and obviously not only getting bigger, but in a way that it has, with Finland, obviously, with a direct border with Russia. That's clearly, and both Sweden and Finland, very powerful militaries. So that's not really quite the objective he was looking for, I don't think.
No, very true.
Totally different tack. We talked at the top of the episode about your new role as National President of the Royal British Legion, and sadly the circumstances which you came into the role. But I obviously have, I marched at the Cenotaph most years. Sadly, this year I won't be there. I can't. And I've been to the Festival of Remembrance as a participant, actually, when we were doing a tribute to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And it's, I think the RBL is an amazing organisation in all sorts of ways, and touches pretty much all of us if you've ever been in the service. And I mean, obviously, I suspect it's a clear truism that it's a tremendous privilege to do the job you're doing. But this episode, I will put it out on Remembrance Sunday, because I always put my episodes out on a Sunday anyway. And I would just be interested in your reflections of the organisation, of what it does, of what it means to you to be national president, and on remembrance generally.
Well, you're right. It's a privilege. A huge honour, in difficult circumstances. But if Clive's looking down, he'll be delighted that his mate Paul has taken over from him. And I've interacted with Ali, his wife, and she's delighted that I'm taking it on. And so being asked to do it is just fabulous. I think we all have the poppy and RBL in our minds when it comes to remembrance. I mean, it's so powerful. And RBL is a big charity that has the opportunity to do a lot of good, whether that is in care and its care homes, or benevolence for people in their sort of armed forces personnel and their families who need support, in advocacy, and this enormous membership foundation, 2,500 branches of men and women who are meeting because of their shared belief in RBL, in remembering people that have fallen, and in comradeship, which is something that you and I absolutely value. And so this big machine, and it is a big machine, is in one way absolutely fabulous. In another way, for the executives, and I'm not an executive, it's a real challenge to do two things. One is to maintain its momentum and its focus, and the second one is to make sure that it continues to adapt to the circumstances of armed forces today and their families, and also recognise that the Second World War generation is almost gone, I regret to say, but nevertheless there are lots of people who want to continue that remembrance, and to be at the heart of leading the nation in remembrance is something that is I'm just really looking forward to playing my part in that in a very humble way, because it is vital that we do, because what it does is it makes sure that we remember they gave there today for our tomorrow, and it allows us to also ensure that that we recognise the sacrifice of the men and women of the armed forces and their families today, and do everything we can to support them. There's a network of charities. RBL happens to be the largest, but it's a network that must work together, and I think we can work together even better to support the potential beneficiaries. Something that I shall try and do over the next 2.5 years as much as I can.
No, I shall look forward to watching you in both the Albert Hall and with your bowler hat on the 10th of November at the Cenotaph. Very proudly, I'm sure, in that. I have to say, one of my proudest moments doing that. I lead the 6th Squadron contingent. I'm still the president of the 6th Squadron Association, and when I can, I lead the 6th Squadron contingent at the Cenotaph. And I think it was 3 years ago now. We were at the very front of the Veterans Parade, and that meant two things. One is obviously, we were at the front when we started the march past, but also actually we were right at the front for the service and everything that went on, and to be literally there watching it as you will be at the front and center was just an enormous privilege. Something I'll never forget. Very special.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. With an element of sort of determination that it goes well, and hope that I don't do any of those. I don't want to have a podcast in about another few weeks' time where you say, "What's the worst moment of your career, Paul?"
No,
so we don't want any of that.
I'm very clear that won't be. I am actually hoping, talking of another podcast, and you mentioned the Second World War generation, I have lined up, but not yet done it, a plan for a podcast recording with a chap called Colin Bell, who is Lieutenant Colin Bell, DFC, 103-year-old Mosquito pilot, who is quite extraordinary as an individual. He's one of these people, you look at him and he's still incredibly fit and healthy. He's at dinner parties and telling jokes and making speeches, and so that will be a very, very special event if I manage to make it work and get him on the show.
Well, we need to capture their experiences as often and as in any different way. It's so important that we remember it.
Yeah, totally so. Two final questions, quick ones, that I always ask. One is, what is the most memorable event of your career to date, bearing in mind what we just said?
Well, I think I've already said it, Bob, which was bringing HMS Exeter back from her deployment. I'm not sure I can top that. But taking Daring into Portsmouth for the first time, first entry into Portsmouth, we did it in the classically, it was in the fog in Portsmouth that we weren't quite sure whether we were going to be allowed in, but they kept the port open for us to come in. And I had a piper from the affiliated regiment in the eyes of the ship, right in the bow, and lots of hundreds of people in Portsmouth came out and stood along the coastline to see that, and they heard the piper through the fog, and then just this silhouette of this modern warship coming out of the fog as we slid into Portsmouth. And I think that was a moment. I was rather pleased to be alongside safely, I can tell you, because navigating the fog is in and out of a harbour in a new ship is never the easiest thing to be doing.
I was just going to say, coming back alongside is one thing, but I guess also taking her out for the first time, and this is a brand new first-class warship. That must be quite a big deal as well, just to get out away safely, away from the public gaze as much as anything else.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, you need to focus a bit on it. That wouldn't have been a great thing to have done anything too press-worthy on a first exit.
Yeah, I came through again when I was the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff Ops and we were doing the Olympics. I actually came through the Thames Barrier on HMS Ocean when she was brought up the Thames to effectively be a platform for obviously lots of activity during the Olympics. And we were on the bridge, and it was quite interesting to watch the focus of both the captain and the navigator as we came through the Thames Barrier with a very big ship that didn't have any bow thrusters, and therefore was maneuverability-wise, he was pretty committed at one point. When we were going right through the barrier itself, it was very very interesting to watch.
Yeah. What's
the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
So, other than that one.
Yeah, a lot of people say that.
Oh, do they? Okay. Actually, if you go back to this HR process, you know how HR professionals tend to develop questions that are supposed to really test the candidate. So you get all sorts of strange questions. I was asked, tell me when you were surprised that your orders were obeyed. And I completely fluffed it. I still don't know the answer, actually.
Yeah, I'd struggle with that.
So I and this is completely out of the blue. And I sort of gave a rather poor answer to that question, which was part of the reason I didn't get the job, I think. But it was one of those. I continue to reflect on it and thinking, what sort of question was that?
Yeah, wow. I don't know how I'd answer that. That's a probably difficult question. Interesting.
Yeah.
Hey, Paul, thanks ever so much. Now, I knew it'd be fascinating to talk to you. I wish you every success with your RBL role and indeed your other roles as well. I'm enormously grateful for your time today. Thanks ever so much. Very best of luck.
Bob, that's really kind. Delighted. Really enjoyed it. Very good to see you. And good luck yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Take care. I really hope you've enjoyed this interview with Paul Bennett. If you have, please share it with your friends on social media and help get the listenership up for the podcast. That really, really helps us to get better momentum. And leave a review on your podcast provider of choice, please, because that would, again, really make a difference to what we do. If you find the content valuable to you and you're actually making use of it from a leadership development point of view, please consider supporting the show directly. You can do that by going to the Support the Show link in your podcast platform's links and advice and notes that about the show. And alternatively, you can go to www.patreon.com/leading4life. And you'll find the option there to either support the show, be a champion of the show, or be a patron of the show. Just as a supporter, for less than the price of a cup of coffee per month, you're going to actually be in a position that you're really helping me to maintain it. If you join at one of the higher levels, you'll get some additional benefits as well. And I really hope you'll think about doing that because it does make a very, very big difference. Thanks a lot. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.